I shot a video on this earlier. Sat down, cut out all of the ums and the blank staring and the long breaks where I was basically doing nothing except managing my cigarette. And after I had eliminated all of the unessential material and just filler, I still had about 40 minutes. And this was the point that I realized that in order to get through this in any kind of efficient manner, I was going to have to rely to some degree on notes, just to keep me from wandering off track. So, I am going to be cheating for this one. Hope you all don't mind too much. I was talking with an atheist buddy of mine. He and I like to debate back and forth, and we do so fairly regularly. And he brought up the idea of how we go about defining sin. And he was proposing that we can't really define sin as an absolute without the concept of God. That without God, any definition of sin that we're going to come up with is going to be either subjective, is going to be referential, is going to in some way depend on either personal preference or, for that matter, some sort of societal or cultural standard. And I objected to this, and I proposed that we can come up with a relatively universal, someone's going to disagree with any proposition, a relatively universal definition for sin that instead relies on intrinsic characteristics in human psyche. And to this, I proposed that we could define sin as a choice that constitutes an imposition of one's will upon one's capacity to choose. Basically, an exercise of free will that is going to undermine free will. This is a definition for sin that doesn't really require there to be a God for it to work. And better still, when we introduce the concept of God, we find that it still works. Because in the Christian view, self, or identity, is something that is divinely ordained. The human being is an intentional creation. And so, free will being an intrinsic component of that self, and that self being an extension of, or expression of, divine authority, we find that to undermine the self through impositions on one's free will is an affront to the authority of God. If only it was that simple. Again, we're painting in very broad strokes here, so please bear with me. So, what's the problem? Asks my friend, Mr. Hypothetical, who is a very, very useful friend to have. Well, first off, taking free will as a given is problematic in even the best of circumstances. But the neat thing about this is that as we explore the particulars of this proposition, I think we actually come across some interesting implications on the nature of free will. But we'll get to those when we come to them. First, when we're talking about free will, we're not talking about absolute freedom. The freedom to choose anything, literally anything, in any circumstance, and expect that through will and action, our choice will come about. Free will has limitations based on, first, our innate capacities, what we can and cannot do, the options presented by a given choice. And our choices in that context have a limited range. There's a limited range of selections that we may make in any given decision problem, even if the number of choices that we can make is not necessarily limited. There is a range limitation. Now, what am I talking about? What am I talking about when I say that there are unlimited choices, but there is a range limitation? I'm kind of talking about the distance between 0 and 1. There is an infinite number of real numbers between 0 and 1, but there is a clearly defined range. Another limitation that we come across when we're talking about free will is that we do not have the absolute authority to dictate the consequences of our choices. If, for example, I walk up to you and beam you with a cantaloupe, I do not have the power to determine or dictate your response to my action. And this is to the good. This is to the good. If we can choose meaningfully, if our choices have meaningful impact, then those choices must have consequences, and must have consequences in a range outside the scope of the absolute applicability of our will. If our will is to have meaningful impact, then we must be able to choose in such a way that there will be consequences that exist outside the range of our capacity to absolutely determine. I must be able to set something in motion that is beyond my control in order for my choices to effectively have any real meaning. Now, if our choices do have consequences, then they can change the context in which I will make future choices. I can change the circumstances. I can eliminate or add variables to the circumstance. Now, our choices are changing just with the passage of time. Choices change, and the options that are available in any given choice problem are somewhat contingent on circumstance. And those circumstances are going to be changing based on other factors other than our choice. But our choices, in particular, must be able to have a meaningful impact on that context in order for them to be meaningful. So our choices can change what we can and cannot choose at any given point. So the problem here is that we could possibly say that any choice fits our original definition for sin. Any choice is going to have an impact on what we can and cannot choose, just by virtue of changing the circumstances. So in order to make this definition at all useful, we need to get a little bit closer. We need to clarify the issue a little. In particular, we're going to need to clarify how our choices impact our capacity to choose. Now, I've already covered a little bit changing the context. Once we make a choice, we have impacted or altered the context in which we would make future choices. And that is necessary for our choices to be considered meaningful. But there is also another aspect of meaningful choice. And this is where things get a little sketchy, because at this point we have to start talking about identity. And the quickest way to make any problem more complicated is to introduce the concept of identity. Now, identity is in some way defined by choices. There is some support for the idea that choices are an expression of identity, but also we demonstrate identity through the choices that we do and do not make. As our choices can have consequences, those consequences have an impact on our identity. Habit, habitual choice. These are some ways in which identity can be altered by our choices. But also, and the point that I'm mostly concerned with here, is how our choices can impact our habits of perception as reflective of identity.